Done on a Thanksgiving Day. Happy Thanksgiving. Of course, it doesn't really matter because it's a Charles Adler Show podcast, and we always want to believe that the wisdom imparted here transcends a 24 or even 48 or 72-hour news cycle. David McLaughlin is who you're going to be meeting in just a few moments. This guy has one of the sturdiest work ethics in the political business. He happens to be the president and CEO of the Institute of Governance. We'll talk about that. But most important, he has worked for provincial and federal governments in Canada. Among the household names that everyone knows, he worked for the Brian Mulroney government, worked for Finance Minister Jim Flaherty in the Harper government, worked for Bernard Lord, who was the King of New Brunswick for a number of years. He was the premier there and a really good guy. Brian Pallister in my home province of Manitoba. He was a clerk for Pallister for a number of years, but most important, politically, he ran two winning provincial election campaigns for the Manitoba PCs when Brian Pallister was the leader of the PCs. David McLaughlin is joining us now from his home in Ottawa. David, welcome to the Charles Adler Show podcast.
Thanks so much, Charles. Happy to be here.
Thank you. We'll bring it to Canada and to Manitoba specifically, but not before we talk about what's being talked about around the world 24/7, and that's the conflict Israel versus Hamas. Have you ever in your political career done any kind of work for what we, I guess, in general would call the Middle East peace process?
No, I haven't, and I'm happy for that because that's to be honest, I mean, it's such a hard set of issues there. There's no clear way out of it, and hats off and full respect for anybody who digs in to try to find some solutions on it. But I have witnessed, as any Canadian of my age and experience, I guess, or exposure, witnessed any number of peace plans and peace processes, and it's interesting that we one of the hit movies after Barbie and Oppenheimer is Golda, which is a biopic of Golda Mayer in the time that she was a prime minister during the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur is really that war is quite germane to this because that was the last time that some 50 years ago that Israel was surprised and taken aback where its intelligence failed, and of course then Egypt and Syria invaded, and Israel was put on the back foot. So some real obvious parallels here, and I guess it's like anything, Charles. You have to look at the history. It's so rich with history and so flawed with history, the Middle East, but you cannot ignore it if you're trying to figure out a way out.
So 50 years and some days ago, the Yom Kippur War, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, Israel was surprised. I've never understood this business of being surprised that the enemy doesn't respect the Jewish holidays, but I'll just put that aside for a moment. This war with Hamas also started on a Jewish holiday, and once again, the intelligence, which is supposed to be the best in the world, the intelligence operation was surprised, and to use McLaughlin language, Israel was put, and perhaps in some ways is still on the back foot here, because the amount of Israelis killed in early days is just enormous when we compare it to recent wars, including the Yom Kippur War, when Israel was attacked not by a terrorist organization but by nation states, including Egypt and Syria. I want to get to the business of Golda. You mentioned Golda Mayer, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time. Even though Israel prevailed, as it did in all wars, the public did not forgive Golda Mayer. They may be forgiving her now, but 50 years ago, they certainly didn't. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, because you study this much more assiduously than I do, David McLaughlin, but I think Golda Mayer was forced to resign about a year after the war began?
Yeah, it was actually a little less than a year. And in fact, it was in the next year. There were some legislative elections that followed, and she and her party did poorly. But one of the things that happened is the power of protest, Charles. There's it's quite stunning in a way, but there was reservists started, a small group of them started to protest outside the prime minister's office in Tel Aviv. And over time, that started to gather attention. Remember, this is 1973, 1974. There's no internet. There's no email. Like, you don't have that social media automatic sort of getting attention. This was a slow burn. But what you had there in Israel was the military, reservists, average, Israeli citizen soldiers saying, you messed up. And that started a whole bit of momentum that led to her losing legislative elections and ultimately having to resign. There was an inquiry, etc. So that is baked into Israel's DNA, and I'm sure there's lots of folks there now talking that kind of parallel. And this will not end well, for anybody, perhaps that's in certain respects, but politically, Mr. Netanyahu and his government is going to wear this. No
All right.
question.
So we've got a situation where Israel was surprised. Now, I want to offer some context here. The domestic affairs of the Netanyahu government have been rather messy. You talk about protests. We've had literally hundreds of thousands
Correct.
of Israelis in the streets. I don't want to get into the bowels of what the issue is with Netanyahu and the Supreme Court. I don't want to get too much into domestic politics. Suffice to say that many people who have been completely agnostic about who governs Israel and domestic politics have been warning in recent months that the disunity in Israel could threaten national security. Some people saying that were seen as alarmist. How did you see them then? How do you see them now?
I think it's a legitimate concern. I mean, if you think about the nature of the Israeli state and how individual citizens, serve, and there's that form of conscription. They are reserves in the reserves, and that, and the demand on each citizen to help defend the state. I mean, this is the one unifying piece of Israel. As you look at it of the Israeli, society, as you look back in a very divided society these days, especially of late, as you said, because of what Netanyahu is doing in his judicial reform. So, it's nothing like a conflict and a crisis to unite people, but they'll be united, for a while until we see where this goes. And at this point, nobody can absolutely predict where it's going to go. There will be a reckoning. There's going to be a national security reckoning. There's going to be a political reckoning. There's going to be, reckoning of unfortunately, for lives lost on all sides here. And so it's just like there's nothing good you can say about this, about what's happening now. And we're predicting what is going to happen, Charles, is it's a mug's game to a certain degree.
Help us understand something. We're getting conflicting reports about whether or not Israeli intelligence, the so-called IDF, the Defense Force, whether or not it had warnings, because of course they've got satellite photos over all of Gaza all the time, and there have been reports that there were warnings that the Hamas military wing was doing some sort of rehearsal, or it looked like a rehearsal for a substantial operation. We, in fact, have the Israelis on record saying that over 1,000 Hamas terrorists did get into Israel, which sounds like an amazingly high number. So here's my question. The storyline is that warnings were offered to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and he ignored the warnings. He didn't take them seriously. It's hard to believe, not because I'm carrying any water for Netanyahu. I just think, based on what I do know, that if the Israeli Defense Force and the various security agencies of Israel, which I guess make up the Israeli intelligence ecosystem, if they're aware of something serious, whether or not the Prime Minister is taking it seriously, the Defense Forces do take it seriously.
Absolutely. But, they need authority to act. And what we don't know yet is like what was happening inside, what kind of distractions there, what kind of governance, if you will, inside was in place to take this information and do something with it. Israel has not been afraid to take preemptive strikes in the past. So with this kind of buildup, and I've read those same stories as you, Charles, and they're quite stunning in a way. Like this was almost in plain view, really. And it seems like on the surface, anyways, that folks didn't believe. They weren't believing what they were seeing with their eyes, or they weren't, 1 and 1 equals 3. They weren't figuring out that in fact this could be a dress rehearsal in some sort. No, they would never do that. Well, uncertainty and surprise is the best weapon in conflict. I'm sure, it was probably it was probably a Chinese philosopher that said that, but this is the case. So what did they do with it? I mean, this is going to have to come out in some kind of inquiry. What we do know is that they were surprised, they were taken aback. people's lives were lost, and this terrorist group, Hamas, scored a major initial victory. We'll see where it goes in the end. I suspect they're going to pay a very punishing price. But for now, they are leading they're creating the momentum here for their cause.
Let me just develop this a little bit here, because I'm still a bit foggy. If the head of Mossad or the head of Shin Bet or the head of the IDF, if the head of Israeli intelligence or the military, if a senior official says to the prime minister, look, these guys are planning to send hundreds of people, maybe even 1,000 over the border. They're going to be kidnapping. They're going to be blowing up a major event. They're going to be knifing and shooting people, etc. In other words, if the prime minister had a heads up of what actually happened less than 72 hours ago, do you, David McLaughlin, believe that the prime minister would just say, "Nice try, but just move on"? I have a hard time buying that.
Yeah, it is really hard to believe that one of two things: that intel was very clear and direct in a way to act on it. But you don't have to do, if you weren't sure, you didn't have to do the preemptive strike. You wouldn't, but you could have beefed up security. You could have done some other measures. Could have been warnings, I guess, to the communities in the area. I mean, I'm sure there's some other things that could have been done. Look, it's a failure almost of imagination. It's a failure to imagine that Hamas would actually do this, that they would be bold and brazen enough to do that at this time, I guess. So it's either way, it's a failure. So if they had the intel and they didn't act, then they are clearly made a mistake and they're going to pay for it. If they didn't have the intel, it goes to what you're saying, Charles. Like it's almost extraordinary to think of that Israel would have its intelligence services would have let themselves down. That's the first line of defense for this small state in the world of part of the neighborhood of the world that it inhabits. Like not having the right intel is a guarantee of this kind of thing happening.
Is it fair to say that no matter what we know at the moment, and no matter what was known several days ago or not known, we will know far more when there is an inquiry done in Israel after this whole thing is over, regardless of how long it takes? Are you confident that there will be an objective judicial inquiry in Israel to find out what happened and what didn't happen?
Well, your last few words, objective judicial inquiry, takes us into the episode in the recent history of what Netanyahu and his government have been doing to try to reform, quote unquote, corral, be more precise, I think, the judiciary here. So who runs that inquiry, how it is conducted, and that will be really, really critical. But I think there's going to be a reckoning, but Israel is going to have to do it in its own particular way, in its own political way. I just want to, just going back on the intel for a second, and it's not exactly a parallel, but it shows something. In the intelligence discussion that was going on in Canada about Chinese interference in elections, there was the David Johnston rapporteur report and there was evidence in there about bad governance, if you will, about how the intel services were working together, how they're collecting information, they get it in dribs and drabs, right? It's not always a clear path. There's never really, here's the secret memo that tells you the strategy. You put these things together. And the intelligence community in Canada was not well sequenced, let's just say. It did not connect the dots in certain ways. And that it's hard to imagine that could be the case with Israel, given its history and the absolute centrality of good intel for this, but it can happen. And so sometimes, in politics and in life, the simplest solutions and the most human basic things are what's going on. And maybe that's part of it here too.
Before we move on from the Middle East, there's one critical aspect that I think we need to cover. Mm-hmm. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that Iran has had a direct role in this particular operation, that Iran had to give the green light before it could happen over the weekend. Others are saying that isn't necessarily the case, but it seems everyone agrees there is a deep connection between the politics of Iran and the massacre in Israel on Saturday. Yeah. What does David McLaughlin think at the moment of the connection between Iran and Israel, and what that may do with international politics going forward?
I think there is exactly what you say, a deep connection. Hamas is, as a terrorist group, is funded by Iran and in large part. And whether they take instructions, they certainly are influenced by Iran. But I've also read, in the case of this particular story, I've also read counter pieces, which including from official U.S. sources who are on the record saying they can't draw that parallel just yet. They're not sure and other things. So I think I think one should be very wary of the Iranian connection. I think we should chase it down. But we've also had the experience of intelligence taking us into bad places in the Middle East where that intelligence was not exact. And I'm thinking, of course, of Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. And there is always, in American politics and other politics, there is always a community, a clique, if you will, or whatever, that has a view that something is happening, and then for other reasons will try to drive us in that way. Ambassador Bolton, former ambassador, of the UN for under the Republicans, and that saying this, and Bolton was one of the so-called Vulcans, as they said, who helped develop that whole narrative that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. Well, it's not, he wasn't in the same way. So I'm more worried about where people draw conclusions from this and take us down into a pathway of more conflict with Iran directly when we're not absolutely sure. But Hamas and Iran absolutely are linked. What we don't know yet is exactly how they work together or not in this particular instance.
David McLaughlin, I want you to just put yourself in the shoes of David McLaughlin, someone who is an expert over the years in working with governments, both provincial and federal. So let's say you're working for Joe Biden, and you read the story in the Wall Street Journal about Iran giving the green light to make this happen. Do you, as Joe Biden's advisor, tell him that he should go public with his feelings about that? Or do you say to sources that you deal with at NBC, CBS, the New York Times, what have you, do you say to them that the Wall Street Journal isn't what it's cracked up to be? Is it in your interest as the Biden administration to stay mum about that for now?
Right now, you want to keep the focus on Israel defending itself. And so any message track or conversation that takes us into Iran or other actors at this stage would be distracting. So it's a good question you're asking, Charles. And I think, my advice, if I was there, would be to say, focus on what's happening right now. The state, Israel needs to stabilize the situation, its security situation with Gaza. The U.S. should be all in on that, as should Canada and other countries, democratic countries. There'll be time to chase down these other elements. And what we don't know is, of course, how does Hamas respond? Well, they'll defend themselves in that, but how does Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other actors in the Middle East respond to this dynamic, which might change, the way that the U.S. deals with it. What we do know is that if America plants a flag and says it's your fault, that'll get some people very focused. But America does not have the same moral authority that it used to have, and it will also create a counter push on it. So good question, Charles. I would say, Biden, bide your time.
Let me bring U.S. domestic politics into this, because it doesn't matter where it's happening, Israel, Iran, wherever. Domestic politics still appears to determine how foreign policy is shaped. From a domestic political perspective, is it in the interests of Joe Biden to look like he's about to start a war with Iran? No.
I don't think it is, but he's going to get spanked a bit in the Republican Congress, perhaps unfairly, because very recently the U.S. administration released Iranian assets, some $6 billion, as part of negotiating to bring back some hostages and other stuff. And it's the time period is so fresh that Republicans opposed to Biden, opposed to the Democratic administration, will say, "Oh, you gave that money to." You allowed Iran unfroze those assets. Iran then took that money, bought munitions, gave it to Hamas, etc. again, like it's not at all clear that that would have been the case. So I think he's already has a bit of a domestic issue that he has to work through. I don't see him, declaring Iran as the as the number one terrorist sponsor, and in the same way that George W. Bush did, and axis of evil or what have you. That doesn't appear to be Biden's style. And I think it would be premature. I mean, Israel is the focus, and I'm presuming that he's going to keep the focus there.
The Republican story about the $6 billion appears to be a canard. I mean, Iran has been helping Hamas for years. The $6 billion is a recent development. The idea that Iran just cooked this up in the last few days, is a non-starter.
It's nonsensical, but it's the politics of it. It's the domestic politics, as you know. Right.
For sure, and certainly the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the others. I mean, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter
whether there's a factual foundation. It's a hell of a story.
Yeah.
So let me bring this now to Canadian politics and Manitoba politics specifically. But before we do that, when I introduced David McLaughlin as the CEO of the Institute of Governance.
Governance, yeah.
What does that mean? What do you do?
We do two main things. We help government organizations perform better. We help do audits of the way that they govern themselves. We look at everything from their decision-making process to their values and ethics. Are they aligned with their mission, et cetera? And we help them work through to deliver better outcomes. I mean, good government is really a function of good governance. I mean, our the BNA Act, right, Charles? Peace, order, and good government. You could strike out government and put in and insert governance. You'd have the same sort of the same issue, the same precept. The other thing we do is we help train public servants. We teach them how to be good leaders, how to deal with the contemporary issues, and serve better. So governance is about outcomes for people. It's whether we have good governance helps determine whether things like healthcare is delivered the way we want, or whether our airports run on time, the right way, et cetera. It's the way we work in government. And so that's what we do. We help. We're a nonprofit, small charity, and that's our gig.
Does poor governance, or let's call it incompetent governance, does it threaten democracy?
No question. No question. Because people, for two reasons, I think, Charles. One is people give up on government, and they start to, and then that takes it to the second thing, is they start to make assumptions about what's going on there and why decisions are being made. It's critical that we have transparency and accountability in how decisions are made in order for the public to adhere to them, whether it's public health orders in an emergency or whether in a public health emergency, but also foundational for democracy. Democracy works when you have two basic conditions: a clear winner and a good loser. You have to accept losers. Like if you lose an election, you have to be able to accept that I lost the election, and therefore it's somebody else's turn. The whole dynamic, as we see in the U.S., of course, is the elections were rigged or et cetera. I mean, this is inimical and corrosive to democracy, and we're seeing some of that being, of course, imported into Canada. So yes, to me, governance is incredibly central to our democratic system, the way we work, and we don't pay enough attention to it. We tend to think that things will just happen. We demand instant gratification from government. Why is the decision made yesterday? Why is it perfect across the board? Why doesn't everybody get the same thing? I mean, that's not life, and it's not the way government works. So there's work to be done, Charles.
But at the granular level, it's fair to say that not getting people their passports when they're expecting them, the airports not running properly in other areas of competence and incompetence. For instance, if it would have taken us another 6 months to get the vaccines, those are the kinds of things that make people feel that democracy is not what it's cracked up to be. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. And it's central. I mean, if government isn't there to do what it's supposed to do, what's the point? Right? It's as simple as that. And I think governments that lose sight of of delivering services to people and staying connected with people are running real risks of as you say, this democratic corrosion. I think is occurring, and I think that's a lot of it post COVID, but with some of it was before. And I think we're into a trust crisis for sure.
So there was an election in Manitoba a week ago. Now you've got a good deal of experience with the elections in Manitoba because you ran two of them very successfully for Manitoba Progressive Conservative leader Brian Pallister. Those were big successes, big majorities of the Manitoba PCs. right now you'd have to say they had a big fail. There's a discussion that's been generated by the manager of the campaign, Marnie Larkin, that there was some sort of intelligence, some sort of research telling them that in a 57-seat legislature, things were going so badly for the Manitoba PCs, not just in Winnipeg, but in rural Manitoba, which is their base, that they were going to be down to 12 seats. Now, you published a graphic, or a graphic has been published, and you've posted it on your Twitter feed having to do with seats in Manitoba. And I wonder if you'd give us a response, first of all, to the notion that the government was threatened to the point of losing so many seats that it would be just down to not even a baker's dozen, but only 12. What do you make of that comment, and what about this graphic?
Well, there's spin in politics, as you know, but that's windmill size spin. I mean, that's just it doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up when you look at past elections. The last time the Conservatives had 12 seats in Manitoba was 1953. It was just never going to be like that. There was no question this was an NDP election to win. But the idea that the Conservatives were down to that low level of support, it just doesn't bear any resemblance to the facts, either past history or as you look at this graphic. So if you're looking at this graphic here, what do you see? You see the NDP seats at the top and the Conservative seats at the bottom, with that one lonely red Liberal in there, and it's in descending order for the New Democrats in terms of how they got to their majority. They got to 29 seats when Kirkfield Park flipped to them, and then that was 29, and then that's a majority, and then they got the rest underneath. You can see there Dauphin, McPhillips, Waverly, Legend-Modiere, and that brings them up to their 34. And then you look at the Conservative seat. So Brandon West, usually a good Conservative seat. It was tight this time, and so yeah, you can maybe make a case something was happening in Brandon. But look at Tuxedo. I mean, Tuxedo has always been Conservative. It was a narrow Conservative win, largely because of the incumbent MLA and leader of the Conservative Party. I mean, I don't think there's any question there was a vote against her in that riding. But for the Conservatives to have been down to 12 seats, then you have to look at all those other blues underneath, count them up, and I take another 10 seats away. They had 22. Take them down 10 more seats, and say that those all would have gone NDP. There was no evidence in the campaign that was the case, and none of the public polling bears that out, Charles. So that would have, if they were worried about that in the campaign, that meant they had to have been polling in rural seats. I've yet to hear of any campaign strategy makes any sense to poll in safe Conservative seats. Like we never did in 2016, 2019. You poll in your target seats in order to pull them across, see what what works for you. So I don't think it holds up. I understand why it's being propagated. It's a way to sort of deflect blame and responsibility, but the evidence just isn't there.
So I need to ask a communications question. Look, Manitoba is not a village. I mean, it's a province. It's got over 1.5 million people. But the problem is, when we're talking about ridings, ridings are like villages, and everybody knows everybody. And most people, especially in rural Canada, are families who have been there for multi-generations. They know whether or not they've given up on the Manitoba PCs. They know whether or not there's an existential threat to the rural base of the Manitoba PCs. So they all know that this is, just to be polite, blarney.
Yes.
It's a communications question. I want to ask you, David McLaughlin, you're an expert in public communications. What is the point of any campaign manager, and it's not about her, she is speaking for the Manitoba PCs, this is about the credibility of the party. What is the point in telling a yarn that is obviously a yarn?
It's all for personal redemption, I guess. It's like, the only thing I can think of, it's like, don't blame me. Like, I somehow wasn't responsible. And that's, there's no sense of accountability or responsibility that goes with that. So it's a made up factoid. And if, we know enough in these days, if you kick around a fact, a quote unquote fact, a number or something like that, and eventually, it might stick. And that's why it's important to sort of show what's happening here with the basics. If you look at the election, this was not a change election, Charles, in Manitoba. It was about 55% turnout. The last time the turnout was higher than 55, and most recent was 2016 when Pallister won, was about 57, almost 58%. 2011, 55%. 2019, 55%. 2023, 55%. So this was a fairly stable electorate where seats were kind of moving around a bit. But the idea of if they were down to 12 seats, then you would have seen this more massive movement of votes that went out. In fact, I was looking at the numbers. The NDP got 221,000 votes this time out. In 2019, the Conservatives won with 222,000. In 2016, with 232,000. So it's not like, and that's not an existential threat. 222,000 NDP votes is not an existential threat to the Conservatives. It is a change of government for sure. So I think the campaign was so controversial in the end because of the anti-search the landfill ad. Terrible ad in all sorts of levels. But the evidence is very clear to me, Charles. The campaign was lost before that ad came out, and it was lost for strategic reasons that have to do with a lot of positioning, the way that the government and the premier acted, the fact the premier wasn't even out on the campaign trail, basically voting non-confidence in herself. I mean, there's so many factors in there that come into play.
Well, we're involved in. I'm a baseball fan. Forgive me for this, but I do a lot of baseball metaphors. So we're involved in the baseball playoffs right now, in the major leagues, the divisional series on right now. And you've got some teams like the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Baltimore Orioles who played extremely well during the regular season, but now in the playoffs, not so much. I mean, it's fair to say that regardless of the credibility that the Manitoba PCs have had over the years in this province, it's fair to say that just like the Los Angeles Dodgers that got blown away in Game 1, regardless of how strong the Manitoba PCs have been over the years, in this particular campaign, they got wiped out because they ran a piss-poor campaign.
Yes. Yeah. Look, it was going to be tough for them. It was second term. It's always tougher going into a third term, but it's been done. No election is preordained. The results are never preordained, right? Things move around. There's always surprises. Things can happen. But Heather Stefanson, as premier, had 2 years to change the trajectory of her government and present herself as a new kind of leader, if she wanted, and gain the trust of Manitobans. Brian Pallister gave her an unprecedented sort of 2 years to do that. In my judgment, it doesn't often happen. She failed in that. So that's why I say going into the campaign, there was lots of things that were going against the government and the PC party, but a lot of them were self-inflicted. The campaign then added to it. Imagine a campaign that says we're a fixed election date and they take a vacation for a month, where they basically ceded the ground to the NDP, which gave them open territory, open water to start to define themselves, put the issues out there. And that was the time when healthcare came out so strongly. Everybody knew it was going to be an issue, but Wab Kinew grabbed it and was clear on it. He went after affordability. He talked about a gas tax cut. Affordability should be a conservative issue. And they gave that away. And then he would use that time to talk about himself and his personal journey of redemption, etc. Very important speech. And again, he was able to define himself. So in a way that inoculated him to when the conservative attacks came later on, that he had this carapace of support for himself that the conservative attacks couldn't pierce. The Conservative campaign allowed that to happen, and which is almost political malpractice, if you will, in terms of running campaigns. There's lots of things that were kind of going on, but they lost. And Mr. Kinew, I don't want to take anything away from Mr. Kinew and his team. They earned the win. They ran a good campaign, Charles, and they deserve the win in this instance.
So 2/3 of the seats in Manitoba, because 2/3 of the population of Manitoba is in Winnipeg. Winnipeg is a middle-of-the-road community. I know that sounds very, sort of milquetoast, but it is.
It's true, but it's also true.
It's a moderate community. In Winnipeg, we don't tend to take extremists right or left very, very seriously. Yeah. So if you're going to be left, be center left. You're going to be right, be center right. Yeah. It would appear that there are people inside the Progressive Conservative Party right now, who don't seem to, they're almost allergic to the word progressive, and they want to take the party to the right. I get how that can work out in Saskatchewan and Alberta and maybe some other parts of the country. This is my adopted home province. I find it impossible that works in the city of Winnipeg. You've got lots of experience in Winnipeg. What is your thought, David McLaughlin, on whether or not it's credible and wise to move the Conservative Party in Manitoba to the right?
If the party does that and continues on the path that they portrayed to Manitobans at the end, they will guarantee NDP wins for a long time. You need to win. I mean, the electoral math doesn't add up for any party unless you win seats in Winnipeg. In the 2019 campaign, we had a mantra inside the war room. It was called "Women in Winnipeg." That was the demographic. That was that the party needed to win in order to make certain it won government. Classically, Conservatives win with male voters. Less so, there's classically, again, a gender gap where female voters are less inclined to vote Conservative out of the gate. Mr. Canoe was, at the time, his story, which was still just coming out and was a bit new to people, was unsettling for a number of voters.
The story of Canoe's personal
history,
past.
Personal
Right,
past,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the taxi driver issue, the issues with his spouse and partner, and that.
I just want for people to be clear, because
yes.
we've got lots of people tuning in who are not from Manitoba.
Correct.
He had issues with a partner, but that was well over a decade ago. It's not the person that he's currently married to.
Yeah, correct.
Right.
And so there was and he'd written about it in his book, The Way We Walk, etc. And there was, and for at that time, because it was not well aired, there was some discrepancies that were for people. Wait a second here, you're saying one thing, saying another. So that, but I'll come to that in a second. But at that time in 2019, women in Winnipeg was the demographic that Conservatives had to win if they were going to win government, to win seats in Winnipeg, and therefore to form government. You can imagine this landfill ad, which was so categorically unempathetic.
This landfill ad, just so people are clear, the landfill is police believe there are the remains of two young murdered Aboriginal women in the landfill, and various Indigenous groups and the NDP and many other people who are in the middle say the only decent thing to do is to at least try to find them. And the Conservatives have taken a very, very hard policy on that. They use the term standing firm. They're standing firm against digging up the landfill, and they were essentially boasting about it with big billboards during the campaign, and that got many moderate Conservatives rather angry, because it was something that made them feel ashamed. And the Conservative Party responded by doing an ad on whether or not you feel ashamed. It's a secret ballot. Vote for us anyway. David McLaughlin.
I think you've summed it up, and that there's not a chance that what you just spelled out would actually move that demographic, female voters in Winnipeg, to Conservatives, and that they essentially pushed them away. Even if you had an intellectual view or even an opinion that, wait a second, I don't think we should search the landfill. I think it's too much money, or it's not going to work. I'm worried about it's not going to yield anything. I'm worried about health and safety of workers, etc. Nobody really wanted it pushed and shoved down their throat in that way. It was saying something about the party, and that some people didn't like, and that's what happened. So if Conservatives in Manitoba decide that somehow this was just a winning strategy, but just too soon, like we need to, we could do this, but we'll win it next time with this strategy, I think they're deluding themselves. It will not work. That's not where Manitoba voters are. They are centrist, and it's not where urban voters are in Winnipeg. And of course, if you don't win Winnipeg, you cannot win the government.
Last question on this, David McLaughlin, having to do with much more than just the brutality and the cruelty of the landfill ad. Is brutality and cruelty necessary in today's kind of populism? Because it appears to be practiced in certain parts of Europe. It certainly is being practiced in parts of the United States. I will never believe that it works in Winnipeg. But is that part of the problem, that people who are, let's just call them political engineers on the right these days, are so enamored of this politics of brutality and cruelty that they want to believe it works everywhere?
I think it's more an us and them mentality, Charles. I think it's it's the worldview of folks in political parties that see things in a certain way and are very content and satisfied with corralling their group of voters and saying this is the worldview, that only worldview that counts, and anybody else doesn't count. And it's not unifying. It's just like that's the way we see things. And in order to get people to pay attention, in a crowded electoral marketplace, they say very harsh things in order to cut through, get that attention, and then get those votes. So the center is what's at risk here. We used to be in politics. You had political parties as big tent parties. They were called brokerage parties. They brought together the various interests and found a way to leaven that to get the kind of results in a majority, etc. It's less and less the case, and I think this will not succeed. But it's the center that is really, the part. If you're a centrist, you're portrayed as not caring about the right issues. You're labeled. You are seen as being soft on A, B, and C, or what have you. So it's both. It's that dynamic of mobilizing your core vote. And it's also the need to, with so much noise out there in the crowded, communications marketplace, I got to say something really harsh in order to cut through. And who loses with that, Charles? Democracy, our society, and that's where we're at. Trust goes down. The turnout goes down. Like participation goes down. Yeah, you can win for a day, but look at what it leaves you. And I think the Conservative Party in Manitoba is going to learn that lesson. The branding that has happened and occurred to them, to the next leader over this piece, is going to be very tough because of what they said and how they said it. And and they're going to have to find a way to work through it.
Speaking as a Canadian citizen, David McLaughlin, thank you so much for being a good friend of the Centre. And speaking as a podcast host, thanks for being a friend of the show. And we hope to have you back soon.
My pleasure, Charles.
David McLaughlin speaking to us from Ottawa. Thank you very much for speaking to your friends and everyone else in your life about the Charles Adler Show podcast. And of course, you can stream it on any of your favorite podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, any of them. Thank you so much for joining us on this Thanksgiving Day or whenever you choose to listen to this podcast. I'm Charles Adler.